That evening, while the whole workshop was decorated with balloons and the workers shouted, "Hooray!" in my honor, I stood with a glass of lemonade and watched my son smile on stage. He held the keys to the company I had built over 40 years. He thought it was a legacy. He didn't know that a month earlier I had sold the land under the factory with a lease agreement, but no option to buy. He handed me a plaque that said, "To the best father," and on Monday he was due to make his first rent payment. I liked how firmly he shook my hand. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Ronald Dixon. I was 72 years old, and for the past 43 years, I had been the owner, operator, and quiet backbone of Dixon Manufacturing, a metal fabrication business tucked just off Route 12 in southern Indiana. We were a small to medium outfit, nothing fancy, but respected, specializing in custom industrial parts, precision grinding, and gear modification for farms, warehouses, and military supply chains. If it needed teeth, weight, or steel integrity, chances were we could make it, faster and better than the factory it came from. I was never a dreamer, not the kind who talked about legacy or building something for the future. I built because I had hands, and I fixed because I had no one else to call. That Friday morning was supposed to be my last official day, my retirement day. That word still felt strange in my mouth. After all, what does it mean to retire from something you never stopped becoming? I arrived at the shop earlier than usual, around 5:30, while the sky was still dark and the gravel in the lot still glittered with frost. The old Chevy truck hummed beneath me, slow and dependable, its heat never quite catching until I was halfway through the shift. I parked in my spot, the same place I'd parked for 4 decades, and killed the engine. My breath rose in slow clouds in the cab, and I took a moment to look at the building. The shop had changed over the years, but it was still the same at its bones. A long, wide steel structure, sectioned into bays, each one humming with its own rhythm. The main floor had 7 workstations now, and each one was painted with the familiar oil-blackened footprints of hard men doing hard work. The place had character, and that wasn't something you could engineer on a whiteboard. The sign outside still bore my name, Dixon Manufacturing, though I knew that wouldn't be for long. The new logo, designed by some marketing firm my son hired, was scheduled to replace it by next quarter. Sleek, efficient, lifeless. I didn't fight it. I didn't embrace it either. Inside, the lights were already flickering on, one row at a time, buzzing softly like old bees waking up. The break room smelled of burnt coffee and hand sanitizer. The vending machine whirred to life, and the floor heaters coughed through their morning ritual. I walked the floor as I always did, slow, steady, observing without interrupting. That was something I had learned early on. You don't command respect by barking orders. You earn it by being the one who shows up first, who fixes what no one else wants to fix, and who stays late when the motor doesn't cooperate. Most of the guys had arrived by 6. I greeted them with nods, handshakes, a few shoulder claps. These weren't just employees. They were welders, millwrights, pressmen, grinders, craftsmen in their own right. Men who knew the weight of a miscalculated angle or a 1/10 of a millimeter tolerance error. We had men who didn't say much, but could listen to a gearbox and tell you what was wrong before they opened it. That kind of skill wasn't taught anymore. It came from years, from sweat, from watching your own mistakes burn and learning not to flinch. The air inside the shop was warm and thick with metal and oil. The sound of machines tuning up was like a kind of orchestra to me. Hydraulic presses sighed to life. Belt sanders began their angry whir. Arc welders sparked in the distance, little suns in the shadows. That sound, the deep rhythmic pulse of creation, was home. As I moved past Bay 3, I caught sight of Bobby Torres adjusting the torque settings on the CNC lathe. I'd hired him 15 years ago when he was fresh out of a trade program and green as grass. Now he could write his own code, blindfolded. He didn't look up as I passed, but he gave a subtle nod. That meant more to me than any speech. In Bay 6, the smell of coolant hung thick in the air, and the floor was already wet with trace lines of water from the morning sweep. Someone had drawn a smiley face in the condensation on the door of the heat treat oven. The kind of thing that would have driven me nuts 20 years ago. Now I smiled. Around 7:30, someone started decorating. I heard laughter from the break room, the sound of balloons being inflated and streamers taped to the ceiling. I didn't need to look to know that Cindy from accounting was behind it. She'd always had a soft spot for holidays and milestones, and I had learned long ago that fighting her optimism was a losing battle. There was a folding table being set up near the tool crib, and trays of food started arriving. Foil pans of barbecue, coleslaw, and mac and cheese. A sheet cake, way too big for the crew, had been wheeled in on a cart. On top, written in blue and red icing, "Happy Retirement, Ron," with a small drawing of a wrench that looked more like a fishhook. I nodded in approval. It was too much, too loud, but honest. That was enough for me. By noon, the buzz of machines gave way to music, and the guys began to congregate. The second shift was called in early so the first could take part. I stood by the tool wall, arms crossed, watching it all unfold like a man attending his own wake. Someone handed me a plate. I took it. Not because I was hungry, but because it gave my hands something to do. My eyes wandered across the room. Every corner of the building held a memory. The spot where the first fire broke out in '86, the beam I'd hammered in with my own hands during the second expansion, the crack in the floor near the North Bay, where I'd dropped a gearbox that nearly took out my foot. This wasn't just a shop. It was my entire adult life poured into concrete, steel, and hours. And then, the microphone. It stood at the end of the table near the cake. Someone tapped it. Feedback crackled. I knew what was coming. My son would speak. There would be applause, maybe a few jokes, maybe a plaque. It was all part of the process. A good man steps aside. A good man lets go. That was the story they wanted to tell. I looked down at my calloused hands, the scars like braille across my knuckles. They didn't feel like letting go, but they didn't need to fight either. Let the room cheer. Let the camera phones flash. Let the speeches flow. Because I had already done the only thing that mattered. The silence between the gears, the rhythm of the welders, the pulse of the press. Those were still mine, even if my name no longer hung above the door. And as the first words of my son's speech echoed through the shop, I stood still and listened, not to what he said, but to what I already knew. The shop was full of noise, but I was already elsewhere. By the time they handed him the microphone, the lunch tables had been cleared, the foil trays empty, and the cake carved into uneven squares. A few smudges of red and blue icing still clung to plastic forks abandoned in paper bowls. Most of the guys had gathered around the folding chairs, leaning on machines or sitting on toolboxes, holding cans of soda or bottled water like communion. The music had quieted to a murmur in the background. And there he was, my son, standing center stage, so to speak, beside a portable PA system on a rolling cart, flanked by a display board with laminated photos from the early years. Jake Dixon, 43 years old, graduate of Purdue, MBA from Indiana University, my son, my blood, and now, at least in the eyes of the crowd, the new head of Dixon Manufacturing. He wore a tailored gray suit, slim cut, no tie, polished shoes that had never stepped in oil or grit. His beard was trimmed with precision, his hair styled neatly, probably with some kind of product that smelled like citrus and ambition. He didn't look like a man who came from this place, and maybe that was the point. He looked like someone who belonged on a conference stage, not in a welding bay. I stood in the back of the room near the parts inventory cage, arms folded, a paper plate with 2 leftover deviled eggs sitting on a nearby stool. I didn't smile. I didn't scowl. I watched. Jake took the mic with confidence, the kind you don't inherit. You cultivate it in boardrooms and presentations, in startup pitch decks and investor meetings. He cleared his throat, gave a little nod, and started speaking. His voice echoed across the shop floor, bouncing off steel beams and concrete walls, smooth and clear like a recording. He opened with gratitude. Thanked the team for being there. Thanked Cindy from accounting for organizing the celebration. Thanked the foreman and the floor managers. Thanked me for building the foundation, for the unshakable standards, for 40-plus years of excellence. His words were well-crafted, rehearsed but not robotic. He knew how to perform. Then he pivoted, like a good speaker does. He started talking about the future, about modernization, about digitally integrated workflows, production efficiency, and agile scaling. Words that probably made sense in a shareholders' meeting, but floated here like helium, too light to matter, too foreign to land. The men nodded politely. Some even clapped, but I saw their eyes drifting. One guy rubbed his thumb along a callus. Another scratched the back of his neck, glancing toward the time clock. These weren't men who feared change. They were men who hated pretense. Jake pulled out a small plaque from a gift bag. Black wood, gold trim, engraved plate. My name on it, beneath a company logo, beneath a quote, something inspirational and vague. He held it high like a trophy, then walked over to hand it to me in front of everyone. Cameras clicked. Someone whistled. There were claps, a few cheers. Jake smiled wide, like he believed this was the moment we'd remember for the rest of our lives. I took the plaque. It was heavy, slick, overly polished. I turned it in my hands like I was inspecting a tool I hadn't asked for. I gave him a nod. Nothing more. The applause died quickly. He turned back to the microphone, unfazed. Then came the keys. He reached into his pocket and pulled them out. My old ring of shop keys. They jingled faintly as he raised them in the air. Symbolic, ceremonial. He said something about passing the torch and honoring the past while stepping into the future. More words, well delivered, carefully practiced. I knew those keys. I had carried them in the same right-side pocket of my jeans for decades. They had worn a groove in the denim, left a mark on my thigh. Each one told a story. The front gate, the welding cage, the old breaker panel in the back office that had to be jiggled just so. They didn't just open locks. They opened memory. He handed them to me first, for a photo. I held them in my palm for a second too long, then placed them gently in his. More cameras flashed. Someone made a joke. I didn't hear it. Jake wrapped things up with a speech about transition and growth and the enduring spirit of Dixon manufacturing. He smiled through every word. Then he invited the team to come forward, grab a slice of cake, and share a memory or two. Music resumed in the background. People started to move again. The spell broke. I stood still. I watched him mingle, laugh, shake hands, take photos with the crew, some of whom I knew he'd barely spoken to before. He made it look natural, and maybe it was. Maybe he believed every word he said. Maybe he saw himself as the next chapter in a great story. Maybe he thought the applause meant something more than habit. But I knew different. He thought he'd received a crown. But what he held were keys to a building on borrowed land. He didn't know the ground had shifted beneath his feet, that behind every congratulation was a silent clause, that the applause would fade long before the first rent invoice arrived in his inbox. He told me to enjoy my rest. I looked at his handshake and thought about Monday. I signed the papers in silence. No fanfare, no witnesses beyond the woman across the table in the beige blazer with the neutral expression and the notary stamp beside her elbow. Her pen clicked twice before she handed it to me. It was smooth and cool in my hand, the kind of pen meant for decisions, not doodles. I scrawled my name across the bottom of the last page with the same slow confidence I used when tightening the final bolt on a gearbox. No hesitation, no second guessing. The ink dried quickly. The room smelled faintly of toner and air conditioning. The blinds were drawn, and a soft yellow light buzzed overhead. The office was small, tucked behind a nondescript door in a commercial building outside of town, far enough from the plant that no familiar face might wander past. I didn't want to be seen. Not yet. Not until it was done. The documents were precise, drawn up over the course of a month, reviewed line by a lawyer who said little and charged much. But she had done her job well. The sale was clean. Full transfer of land ownership. The building and machinery still belonged to the company, but the ground beneath it, the dirt, the concrete foundation, the footprint of the entire operation, belonged now to a holding firm out of Chicago, a shell company for a real estate investment group that specialized in long-term commercial leases. Anonymous, corporate, impersonal. That's what I wanted. The lease agreement was ironclad, 10 years with annual rate increases, non-transferable, no buyback clause, no purchase option. Jake wouldn't be able to reclaim it, even if he tried. The rent was set fairly, not high enough to break him, just enough to remind him that nothing worth holding comes free, and certainly not by birthright. I didn't sell the land out of bitterness. There was no revenge in my chest, no desire to punish. I sold it because I knew what came next. I had watched too many shops go under when the second generation took over with soft hands and clean shoes. It always started the same way, with optimism and buzzwords, meetings about pivoting and modernization, promises to scale the model or attract new investors. But they didn't understand what built the walls they inherited. It wasn't strategy decks or quarterly projections. It was grit, risk, skin in the game. Jake had never risked anything. Even when he joined the company, he kept his consulting job on the side for nearly a year. He called it hedging, as if commitment were a liability. I let it slide back then, told myself he needed time, that he'd come around. But time taught me something else. Jake saw the company as a vehicle, not a purpose, not a weight, just a thing to drive toward his next success. So I gave him the keys, but not the ground beneath them. The holding company had agreed to notify him of the lease terms the Monday after the retirement party. I made sure the envelope would be hand-delivered, not an email, not a phone call, a man in a jacket holding a letter. I wanted Jake to feel the weight of it in his palm. I signed the final page, slid the folder back to the woman, and nodded. She stood, not unkindly, and offered me a copy in a crisp envelope. I took it, folded it once, and placed it inside my coat. I left the office quietly, stepping out into the afternoon light, blinking against the sun. The air smelled like pavement and distant cornfields. A breeze moved the flag on a nearby pole, the sound of its flapping oddly satisfying. Back in the truck, I sat with the engine off for a while. My hands rested on the wheel, loose and calm. I thought about the first time I'd seen that land, bare dirt, uneven and rough, dotted with old tire tracks and broken fence posts. It had taken me 6 years to buy it outright, another 5 to build the first structure. I'd poured concrete with my own hands, stained my jeans with oil, slept on a cot in the break room during our first winter because the heating wasn't installed yet. It had cost me everything. Then it gave me more than I'd ever imagined. But I knew land couldn't be passed like a watch or a set of tools. It needed to be earned again by whoever stood on it next. And Jake hadn't earned it. Not yet. I drove back slowly, keeping to the side roads. I didn't turn on the radio, just listened to the hum of the tires and the occasional rattle of something loose in the back seat. The sun shifted lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields. I stopped once at a diner for a coffee. The waitress recognized me but didn't ask questions. I sat at the counter, sipped slowly, and thought about Martha. She would have told me to be kind, to believe in our son. She always believed in the good she could coax out of people, but she also knew the cost of letting pride go unchecked. I remembered the look in her eyes when we had to remortgage the house after a bad deal in '97. The quiet way she boxed up the china she inherited from her mother without a word. She'd understood sacrifice better than I did. When I finally pulled into the driveway that evening, the sky was purple and red, the last bits of sunlight bleeding behind the house. I parked the truck, stepped out, and stretched. My back ached the way it always did at the end of a long day, an honest ache. Inside, the house was quiet. I poured myself a glass of water, sat at the kitchen table, and pulled the envelope from my coat pocket. I opened it again, not because I needed to reread the papers, but because I needed to feel the decision once more. The ink had dried, but the meaning hadn't settled yet. I thought about the look on Jake's face when he'd given me the plaque, when he'd held up those keys like a scepter. He believed he'd inherited something solid, permanent, untouchable, but he hadn't. He'd inherited the shell. The foundation now belonged to someone else, and on Monday, he'd learned that in full. I stood, folded the papers, and placed them in the old cigar box I kept in the back of the pantry. The same box that held my discharge papers from the Army, Martha's letters from our first years of marriage, and the deed to the house we raised our kids in. It was where I kept things that mattered, not because they were sentimental, but because they were real. That night, I slept well. For the first time in a long while, I didn't dream of wrenches or invoices or broken deadlines. I dreamed of soil, of weight, of a man standing on land that didn't belong to him, until he made it his. Saturday arrived like it always did, slow and wide and quiet, the kind of morning where the world seemed to exhale. I woke early, not from any alarm or disturbance, but from the weight of habit. For 40 years, my Saturdays started before sunrise, long before the hum of machines or the buzz of fluorescent lights. I had always liked being the first one in the building, the first to touch the cold steel of the door handle, the first to flip the breakers and hear the building come alive. But that Saturday was different. There was no shop to open, no schedule to review, no punch clock to check, just stillness. I brewed my coffee the old way. No machine, just the stovetop percolator and the kettle I kept from my Army days. It hissed softly as I waited, the sound strangely comforting in the emptiness of the kitchen. Outside, the sky was pale and undecided, not quite ready for daylight. The porch light cast a soft glow across the front steps, highlighting the faint dust I hadn't swept in days. I stood there for a while, coffee in hand, watching the shadows shift slowly across the yard. For the first time in decades, I wasn't expected anywhere. No deliveries, no meetings, no fires to put out. I should have felt free. But freedom comes with a strange echo when it follows years of structure. I had spent my life measuring weeks in tasks, orders filled, parts assembled, deadlines met. Now there was only the soft ticking of the kitchen clock and the occasional creak of the house settling into its own quiet rhythm. I walked through the rooms without turning on the lights. My footsteps felt loud, even on carpet. I opened the back door and stepped onto the deck, where the wood was starting to gray at the edges. I hadn't replaced those planks in years. There had always been more urgent things to fix. The backyard looked unchanged. Same brittle grass, same line of trees swaying slightly in the breeze. But I knew better. Everything had shifted, even if the surface remained calm. Jake was probably still sleeping, his mind filled with thoughts of the company, of the party, of the next move. He didn't know that Monday would cut the air in a different direction. He didn't know that silence could be deliberate. I sat in the old chair Martha used to love. It creaked under my weight. The armrest still bore the shallow scratches from her knitting needles, from the afternoons she spent untangling yarn and watching birds. That chair had seen more patience than most men would ever learn. I thought of her then, how she'd hum quietly while stirring soup, how her eyes would soften whenever Jake came home late and full of excuses. She'd believed in the future, even when the present gave her no reason to. I wondered what she would say now, about what I had done. I told myself she would have understood, but the truth was, I didn't know. Martha had always seen things I couldn't, felt things I'd been too tired or too proud to notice. The sun climbed slowly. Light filtered through the slats of the deck railing, painting the floor in long rectangles. I watched them move inch by inch, as if time needed to remind me it still existed, even without a whistle or a shift bell. Around noon, I ate a cold sandwich from the fridge, sitting at the same kitchen table where Jake used to do his math homework. I remembered the way he'd press his pencil too hard, leaving grooves in the paper. He never liked redoing anything. He wanted to be right the first time. I used to admire that. Now I wasn't sure. The phone rang once, but I didn't answer. It was probably someone from the Rotary Club, or an old vendor calling to offer congratulations. I wasn't in the mood for voices. I needed the silence. The kind that doesn't explain itself. The kind that grows like ivy, slow, deliberate, and unbothered. In the afternoon, I took a walk down the road. I passed the Miller place, where the barn leaned a little more every year, and the gas station with the broken sign that no one bothered to fix anymore. Everything felt slightly off, as if the town itself had aged 5 years since yesterday. Or maybe it was just me. I stopped by the cemetery on the way back, not out of grief. Martha had been gone long enough that the ache had settled, but out of respect. The headstone stood firm, her name etched deep into the granite. I brushed a few leaves from the base and sat on the bench we had chosen together before she passed. She'd insisted on a bench, said it was rude to make people stand when they were already carrying sorrow. I spoke to her in my mind, the way I always did when I came here. I told her about the party, about Jake's speech, about the plaque and the applause. I told her how proud he looked, how sure. I told her I hadn't cried, and I told her what I'd done, not for approval, just to say it out loud in the place where truth felt safe. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the trees behind the graves. I took it as a sign to leave. The dead don't need visitors. They need peace. Back home, I changed into a clean shirt and wiped the kitchen counters, even though they weren't dirty. I straightened the cushions on the couch, lined up the magazines on the coffee table, checked the locks on the doors. Not out of fear, but because routine was a kind of prayer, a way to remind the body that it still had shape. The hours passed slowly. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't open the mail. I didn't call anyone. I let the day unfold without interruption, each moment falling into the next like dominoes that refused to tip. By evening, the silence felt heavier, not oppressive, just full, like a room packed with unsaid things. I poured a glass of water, sat on the back porch again, and watched the sky bleed into night. The stars emerged one by one, without urgency. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once and then stopped. A porch light clicked off. A car door slammed, and then nothing. Just silence. The kind of silence that doesn't ask for anything. The kind that waits. I leaned back in the chair, closed my eyes and listened. Not for voices, but for the sound of something ending without regret. Monday morning came with the same smell of overripe leaves and distant exhaust, the kind of scent that clings to a town too small to forget its own rhythms. I woke earlier than I had planned. There was no alarm, but my eyes opened as if something in my bones remembered the time. Years of responsibility had wired me that way. No matter how hard the body begged for rest, the mind always answered the clock. Only now, the clock belonged to someone else. I dressed slowly, not in a rush, but not in leisure either. I chose a plain button-down, ironed the night before, and slacks that still fit despite the way age rearranges a man's frame. I tied my shoes with more care than usual. There was a certain quiet gravity to the day, something ceremonial in the air. I could feel it as I buttoned my cuffs, as I combed my thinning hair in front of the hallway mirror. It wasn't vanity. It was discipline. A farewell ritual, perhaps, though no one else would see it that way. The drive into town felt familiar, but I noticed things I hadn't before. The cracks in the pavement near the corner of Maple and 3rd had widened. The old Sinclair sign had been painted over with something sleeker, cheaper. The world kept moving forward, but never quite upward. It stretched and bent, sagged and shifted, just like people. I parked across from the building that once bore my name in proud bronze letters. The letters were still there, but now they looked like a relic, not a declaration, but a whisper from a different era. I stood for a moment before stepping inside. The lobby smelled faintly of coffee and floor wax, same as always. I walked past the reception desk, nodding to the young man sitting there, a new face, likely hired by Jake. He smiled in that vague, polite way that said he didn't know me, just the role I used to fill. Upstairs, the office was already humming. Phones rang, printers clicked, voices buzzed behind closed doors. I walked past them all, a ghost in a suit, invisible in the building I had once built, brick by brick. Jake's office door was open. He was standing behind the desk, leaning over a stack of papers, the sleeves of his dress shirt rolled up in what I assumed he thought was a symbol of effort. He looked up when he saw me, his expression a mix of surprise and pride. He gestured toward the chair in front of the desk like a host seating a guest. I sat without a word, letting the leather cushion fold under me like it had 100 times before. He began talking, full of excitement and confidence, his words tumbling over one another like a salesman with too much product and not enough shelf space. He spoke about plans, new strategies, expansion, real estate evaluations. He threw around words like projections and profit margins and redevelopment. I nodded occasionally, pretending to follow every thread, though I already knew where each one ended. When he paused to catch his breath, I reached into my jacket pocket and slid the envelope across the desk. He blinked, confused, then curious. He opened it and pulled out the letter. His eyes moved quickly, trained to scan, to absorb, to anticipate the next move. But this letter didn't ask for interpretation. It only required acknowledgement. He read it again. Slower this time, then once more. When he finally looked up, the color had drained a shade or two from his face. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came. He didn't need to speak. I had written everything plainly. The letter wasn't cruel. It wasn't vengeful. It was business. It explained that the property upon which the factory sat, land he believed he had inherited alongside the building, had been sold weeks before the retirement party. Not to a rival, not to a corporation, to the town itself. The Municipal Development Board had offered a price I couldn't refuse, and I hadn't. There were stipulations, of course, a 2-year lease, monthly payments, strict zoning terms, use restrictions. Jake could keep operating as usual, for now, but he no longer stood on land that belonged to him, and the first bill was due that morning. I told him this all without saying a word. The paper did the talking, the date at the top, the signature at the bottom, the watermark in the corner, legal, binding, final. He looked at me then, really looked, as if trying to find the man behind the decision. But I didn't offer an explanation. There was no need. He had asked me to step away. He had given me a plaque and a speech and a firm handshake. He had ushered me out like a guest at my own wake. Now he would run the company. He would make the calls, take the meetings, sign the checks, including mine. I stood, adjusted my cuffs, and walked to the door. I paused only once just before leaving, not out of sentiment but to anchor the silence that filled the room. A silence that was not empty but precise, measured, accounted for. Outside, the world hadn't changed. Cars passed, people walked, the sky arched blue and unbothered overhead. But I knew something had shifted, not just in the balance sheets, not just in the deeds or the ledger books, but in him. He had believed himself the owner, the inheritor, the crown prince stepping into his father's shoes. But shoes don't carry power, and ground can be taken from under you even while you're standing on it. That was the lesson I had learned the hard way, decades ago, when a handshake deal turned to ash, and I had to rebuild from dust. I had sworn then that no one, not even blood, would ever catch me unprepared again. So I had written the terms, filed the papers, sealed the envelopes, and waited for the silence. The moment when all the noise, the ambition, the pride, the entitlement, collapsed into realization. That morning I heard it, not out loud, but deep and unmistakable. It was the sound of a boy becoming a man, too late to stop the contract, just in time to read the fine print. The morning after the invoice was delivered, I found myself pulled toward the factory again, though I had no obligation to be there. The day was cold, the kind of cold that snuck into your joints and lingered. I drove without turning on the radio, the silence inside the car as thick as the fog that clung to the streets of our town. For the first time in decades, I was no longer listed as the point of contact, no longer the one to approve purchases or sign off on the payroll. And yet, my fingers gripped the steering wheel with the same muscle memory, as if the past hadn't yet loosened its hold. I parked across the street and sat for a while, watching the building from behind the windshield. The facade hadn't changed, but something about it looked different. Not worse, not better, just less familiar. It was as if time had started to sand down my ownership, shaving it grain by grain until the only thing left was the outline of what used to be mine. I stepped out and crossed the street slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of a quiet desire to observe. When I entered the loading bay, the familiar hum reached my ears immediately. The low vibration of machines waking up, the rolling clatter of conveyor belts, the steady rhythm of presses biting down on metal. It was the same music I had known for most of my life. Each machine had its own personality, its own pace and voice, and I recognized them the way a conductor recognizes instruments in an orchestra. I kept to the edges of the floor, unseen by most, occasionally nodding to workers who looked up and gave half smiles, unsure whether to wave or not. Some of the old-timers nodded back, eyes lingering for a second longer, but most of the younger crew didn't know me, didn't remember my walk, didn't connect the quiet man in the wool coat to the photos in the hallway. I passed the line where the old press still stood, the one we called Martha, though no one ever said why. Her sound was different now, slightly off-tempo, as if she was aging along with the rest of us. I stopped and watched the sheets roll through, punched and stamped, uniform and obedient. My eyes followed the process, and I could see where the bolts had been changed, where new parts gleamed among the dull, oil-blackened frames. They'd done some maintenance, clearly. That was good. Jake had enough sense to keep the equipment running. That, or the lead mechanic, was still the one making the real decisions. I walked further back, toward the packaging unit. The air smelled of cardboard and glue, familiar in a way that hit me in the chest. I used to know every scent that came from this floor, could tell when something was wrong, just by the way the air changed. I could walk in and sense which motor was overheating or which pipe had sprung a leak. It was intuition, yes, but also years of being part of the breathing, sweating organism this place had been. Now, it was just a building, a leased property, a space under new management. I saw Jake's office light on through the high windows, the same office that had been mine for decades. He stood behind the glass, talking on the phone, animated in that way he always was when he thought he was in control. His movements were broader now, his posture more open, as though the chair had finally molded to his frame and accepted him as the new owner. But I knew the chair didn't matter. The lease agreement sat quietly in his inbox, waiting for his signature each month, like a shadow reminding him that the ground under his feet had changed. I walked the perimeter of the floor, tracing a route I had walked thousands of times, past the welding bays, past the locker rooms, past the inventory section where pallets of raw materials sat stacked like potential energy. It was all still functioning, and yet it felt like something essential had gone missing. Not a part, or a tool, or a person, but a thread, an invisible line that had once tied me to every inch of concrete and steel in this place. That thread had been cut by my own hand. I stepped into the break room. The furniture had changed. New vending machines blinked with bright LED displays, and the old corkboard had been replaced by a digital screen showing safety reminders and birthday announcements. My name wasn't listed anywhere, and I felt a strange sense of relief. I sat down at one of the plastic tables, tracing the edge with my finger, remembering the times I'd eaten lunch here beside my workers, wiping grease from my hands with paper towels, talking about football, or weather, or union concerns. I didn't stay long. The factory floor didn't need me anymore. That was the truth I had to swallow every time I let my eyes wander through the building. It would keep running. People would keep clocking in. Materials would keep arriving. Products would keep leaving. And the only change would be the name on the checks and the address on the invoices. But beneath that surface, there would always be the echo. The echo of my voice giving orders. The echo of my hands sketching layouts on napkins. The echo of decisions made in the back of my truck over lukewarm coffee when no one else believed the company would make it through another quarter. I had poured myself into this place, drop by drop, until it held more of me than I had left to give. And now, I had pulled myself back out. Not to punish, not to destroy, but to rebalance. To remind the next generation that ownership was more than a name on the door. It was risk. It was silence. It was watching machines run without you and knowing they wouldn't stop. When I finally left the building, the cold had deepened. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the gravel lot. I didn't look back as I walked to my car. There was no need. I had heard everything I needed to hear. The machines still sang. The air still pulsed. The factory still breathed. But the echo, it belonged to me, and it always would. The weekend passed slowly, like the drag of a dull blade through thick wood. Monday came dressed in frost and silence, the kind of morning that used to rattle the delivery trucks and freeze the steel doors of the warehouse. I woke early, not because I had a place to be, but because old routines die slow, even when they've been shot in the heart. I made black coffee the way I always had, too strong, too hot, and stood by the window watching the street wake up. Somewhere across town, my son was preparing for what he thought would be a regular day at the helm of his inherited empire. I imagined him adjusting his tie in the mirror, smoothing his hair back, telling himself this was the beginning of his reign. But I knew something he didn't. The ground beneath his throne was rented now, not ruled. By mid-morning, I was parked near the company once again, not because I wanted to see him flounder, but because I wanted to see what he'd do when the walls whispered back. Jake had always been a big idea man. Branding, expansion, digital upgrades. He talked in phrases he pulled from management books and podcasts, thought in graphs and infographics, and measured success in followers and likes. I had built the company with calluses and overtime, with handshakes in the dark and decisions made after everyone else had gone home. He believed in systems. I believed in people. From the corner of the lot, I watched as the delivery trucks came and went. I knew the drivers by the sound of their brakes. Same crews, same habits. A few gave me a look of confusion as they passed. They weren't used to seeing me out here in the cold. Not anymore. I stayed where I was, just another old man watching a machine he used to operate. Inside, I imagined the morning unfolding. Jake would have checked his email. He would have seen the invoice. He would have assumed it was a mistake. Maybe he would have called the accountant. Maybe the accountant, confused but obedient, would have called the law firm. The law firm, efficient and clinical, would have confirmed the details without emotion. And then the shape of the truth would start to form, like frost on a windshield. Slow at first, then spreading quickly until he couldn't see past it. I could almost hear the moment the air shifted in his office. The silence that comes when confidence begins to tremble. The sudden awareness that the empire he walked into wasn't built on stone, but on terms. Legal ones with renewal dates and penalty clauses. He had received a company. I had kept the land. I didn't expect gratitude. I had raised him in a world where ownership was earned, not handed out like party favors. But I also didn't expect him to treat legacy like luggage, something to be carried a few steps and then abandoned for something shinier. Jake believed he was the future, and maybe in some ways he was. But I had seen futures crumble under the weight of poor foundations. Around noon, I returned home. I didn't need to see the fallout firsthand. I had planted the truth deep enough that it would grow on its own. I sat at the kitchen table, pulled out the old binder where I kept copies of all agreements, and leafed through them slowly. My signature on every page was like a trail through the forest, each one leading back to a decision made in silence, far from applause or spotlight. Jake had laughed once, saying I still lived in a paper world while he operated in the cloud. But clouds vanish. Paper remains, especially the kind notarized and filed in a fireproof cabinet. That afternoon, my phone stayed silent. No calls, no messages. That didn't surprise me. Jake's pride was a thick wall, and it would take more than one invoice to knock it down. But it had started. He would have to call me eventually, not as a father, not as a mentor, but as a landlord. The word itself carried weight. Landlord. It spoke of ownership, of limits, of the realization that running a company wasn't the same as owning everything it stood on. And while Jake might still sign contracts and send memos, every decision he made now existed within the invisible fence of my final act. An act I had executed without cruelty, but with precision, not to punish, to teach. I thought back to the first time I took him into the factory. He was 7. He had worn a hard hat 2 sizes too big and followed me around wide-eyed and full of questions. Back then, everything amazed him. The noise, the sparks, the smell of oil and metal. He had watched the workers with reverence. I remembered thinking, maybe he had it in him. Maybe one day, this could be his. Years later, he stopped asking about machines, started asking about market share, wanted to change the logo, hired consultants, replaced hand tools with screens. The workers no longer knew who he was. They recognized his title, but not his face. That was the difference between old and new school. Old school knew every birthday on the floor. New school sent mass emails. Old school fixed the press at 2 a.m. New school waited for IT. Old school built something to last. New school built something to pitch. I didn't hate the future. I just didn't trust it to remember what came before. By nightfall, the first message arrived. Not from Jake, but from the maintenance foreman. A brief, polite update about a boiler valve, CC'd to both of us. His way of saying he knew the score. The old man still had a seat at the table, even if no one saw the chair. I replied with a nod of acknowledgement. No advice, no warning, just presence. Because that's what old school does. It stays. Through storms and audits. through turnovers and transitions, through the loud noise of ego and the quiet tick of consequences. It stays, and waits for the new school to realize that some buildings only stand because someone remembered where to put the steel. The morning the rent was due came without thunder. No great tremor shook the earth. No headlines flashed. No horns blared. It was a Monday, like any other. But I knew what day it was, and I knew what it meant. I woke before the sun and sat at the small desk in my den, sipping bitter coffee that had long since lost its warmth. On the screen, the property portal blinked quietly. My name sat beside the owner's tag. The company name Jake used sat in the tenant field, dull and gray like wet concrete. The amount due stood unchanged from the day I set it, a number not chosen out of cruelty, but out of market fairness, a number that by all measures a successful company should easily afford. Still I waited. There was no fanfare in it, no swelling music, no ceremony. Just a moment of silence in which the weight of responsibility began to shift. Not from me to him. No, that part had already passed, but from the abstract to the real. From the comfort of inheritance to the friction of accountability. I checked the timestamp. 9:13 a.m. Still nothing. I left the desk and walked out onto the porch. The chill in the air clung to my skin like questions no one wanted to ask. Across the street, the neighbor was raking leaves in neat, obsessive rows. A dog barked in the distance. The world turned. By 10:30, a small notification blinked in the corner of my inbox. Payment received. Not from Jake, but from a generic company account. No message, no explanation, no acknowledgement. Just a transaction. The first of many. One drop in the slow erosion of ego. I didn't smile. It wasn't triumph I felt. It was a quiet, almost sorrowful recognition that the bridge between us had burned with barely a flame. He hadn't called, hadn't asked why, hadn't tried to understand. He had paid because he had to, because the papers were real, because I had signed them when no one was watching. It was the kind of opening act that didn't need applause. It just needed silence. The kind that follows when someone realizes the ground has shifted beneath their feet, and there's no one else to blame. I spent the rest of the day in the garden. The soil had hardened with the cold, but I worked it anyway, pressing bulbs into the earth that wouldn't bloom until spring. It reminded me of everything I had done in the months before retirement. Quiet, buried work that would one day grow into something undeniable. I thought about Jake, thought about what this moment meant for him. Not just the rent, but the realization. The long, slow dawning that the company he now led existed inside a perimeter he hadn't drawn. That behind every confident stride he took through those halls, my shadow lingered. Not to haunt, but to remind. Remind him that building something isn't the same as inheriting it. That blood doesn't equal foresight. That legacy isn't a guarantee. It's a question asked over time. I had asked myself that question for years. In every overtime shift. In every decision made under flickering fluorescent light. When to expand. When to downsize. Who to hire. Who to let go. Those choices left fingerprints on the place, even after the ink dried on the new signs Jake had installed. I didn't blame him for not understanding it yet. He was raised in a different era, one where things moved fast, and ownership meant logos and leverage, not sweat and stability. But the building remembered. The walls, the beams, the machines. They remembered me, not just as a name on a plaque, but as hands on levers and boots on floors. That kind of memory doesn't fade. I spent the evening rereading the lease agreement. I wasn't worried he'd break it. He was too proud to default. But I read it anyway, page by page, line by line, like a man revisiting a blueprint for a bridge he built alone. I had crafted the terms with care. Flexible, but firm. Room for success, but no tolerance for arrogance. It was less a trap than a mirror, and in time, I believed he would see himself in it. Not the version he liked to post about, but the real one. The one who stood in front of a judge of consequences and had to answer without a script. That night, I didn't sleep much, not out of anxiety, but out of a strange, unplaceable anticipation. Not triumph, not bitterness, just the awareness that something had shifted in the silence, that a process had begun. Not legal, emotional, the kind that started small but spread, slow and unstoppable, like roots through concrete. Jake would never call it defeat. He might not even recognize it for what it was. But I knew. This wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about understanding, about the long, humbling road from pride to respect. And respect, I had learned, rarely came with fanfare. It came with rent paid on time, with emails addressed properly, with silence where once there had been dismissiveness. It came in small ways, but it came. And that was enough. I wrote the letter 2 weeks after the handover, on a morning soaked with fog and the smell of old printer ink. The air in my study felt thick, almost grainy, like it resisted every keystroke. I didn't write it out of anger. I didn't even write it for closure. I wrote it because I knew he wouldn't ask, and because I knew one day he might wish he had. The letter was not long. It didn't list grievances or catalog mistakes. It wasn't a lecture, and it wasn't a confession. It was more like a ledger, a quiet accounting of a father's memory, a builder's warnings, and a man's final attempt to bridge something that had long ago begun to crack. I printed it on the same paper I used for contracts, not out of symbolism, but habit. Old habits die stubbornly, even when the life they belong to has already shifted. The signature at the bottom wasn't dramatic, just my name, written the way I always had, steady, deliberate, unreadable to anyone but me. I placed it inside an envelope, not sealed. I wanted him to open it casually, maybe while clearing his desk or searching for a warranty folder. I slipped it into the top drawer of the desk I once used, the one in the old office I had surrendered to him with more dignity than comfort. He never mentioned it. Days passed, then weeks. I sometimes imagined the envelope resting there, pristine and unopened, like a time capsule nobody requested. And yet, I knew its presence mattered, even unread, like a fire alarm in a room that hadn't caught fire. Yet. The letter was my voice in a future moment. It said things I couldn't say aloud, not because they were too harsh, but because they required silence to carry their weight. It spoke about the floor tiles I'd chosen myself because they absorbed oil without staining, about the contract with the small supply company in Boise that always delivered on time, even when they raised prices, about the woman in HR who'd stayed after her husband died because she believed in what we built, about why the furnace sputtered in winter, and why I never fixed it. I told him about the first client we ever had, the one who didn't pay, and how I let it go because I saw something in myself in his eyes. I told him how I used to sit in the parking lot at night, just watching the windows glow from inside, and how that light made me feel something like purpose. I wrote about the time I almost sold the place, back when the market dipped and everyone said manufacturing was dead. But I didn't, because some things you don't sell, you just survive with them. That part, I hoped, he'd one day understand. I told him I loved him, not as a flourish or a soft landing, but plainly, directly. The way a blueprint tells you where the weight is meant to rest. I didn't ask for anything. Not forgiveness, not thanks, not recognition. Just that he'd one day sit still long enough to listen to a voice that didn't ask for attention. Weeks turned to months. No word. I visited the plant less and less, not out of resentment, but because I had learned to make peace with distance, a kind of quiet in which respect grows, if not love. I kept the backup copy of the letter on my hard drive. I never reopened it. I didn't need to. One morning, I returned to pick up a set of old invoices the accountant forgot to forward. Jake wasn't in, or maybe he was avoiding me. I didn't ask. The secretary offered a smile that looked like pity. The office smelled different. Not bad, just newer. Air freshener and coffee pods. Nothing that said metal or heat or endurance. As I passed my old desk, I glanced at the drawer. Still closed. The edges of the envelope might have been curling by now. Maybe a stain from coffee. Maybe he'd moved it, mistaking it for a supplier's letter or something trivial. Maybe he'd thrown it out. But even then, I knew. The act of writing it had already done its work. I had recorded something he didn't know he needed, and maybe never would. But that didn't make it meaningless. Some things you leave not as a gift, but as a warning. Some letters don't scream when they're opened. They whisper. And if you don't listen, the consequences don't arrive with sound. They arrive with silence. I drove home slowly that afternoon. I didn't play the radio. Just the soft hum of tires on asphalt and the quiet knowledge that I had done my part. The rest belonged to him. The weight of unread words is heavy only for the man who needs them most. The house felt larger than I remembered, though nothing had changed in its dimensions. It was the kind of quiet that doesn't soothe, but accuses. The walls no longer hummed with the faint undertone of footsteps, voices, or familiar interruptions. It was the silence of absence, not peace, and it followed me from room to room like a cautious shadow. I made dinner out of habit. 2 eggs scrambled too firm, toast without butter, a tomato sliced clean in half, no seasoning. It wasn't hunger that brought me to the stove, but the rhythm of repetition. A life that had once moved with purpose, now moved on rails, greased by memory. I ate standing up by the sink, staring out the window at the dry lawn, the slanted mailbox, the neighbor's dog sniffing at the curb. There was no reason to sit. The chair across from mine remained tucked in, untouched since the day she left. I hadn't moved her place setting in years. The ceramic napkin ring, the linen folded perfectly into thirds, the empty glass, these small relics of ritual, suspended in time. Not because I expected her to return, but because erasing her felt like tearing out a beam from the roof. Some structures fall quietly, others collapse loud. I turned on the television and let it talk into the room, its flickering light casting movement onto walls that hadn't seen motion in days. I didn't watch it. I listened to its nonsense babble like a foreign language I didn't care to learn. News cycles, game shows, the endless parade of reruns, each one shouting louder than the next, trying to convince me that the world still spun with importance. I poured myself a small glass of scotch, not out of celebration, not even out of habit, just to feel the weight of the glass in my hand, to let the liquid heat pretend it was feeling. I sat in the old leather armchair by the window, the one with the tear in the left armrest I never repaired. I watched the sun dip behind the treetops, the sky bleeding orange, then pink, then a kind of purple that had no name. Evening came not with drama, but with a slowness that bruised. In that light, the house transformed. Shadows lengthened like fingers across the floors, brushing against the baseboards, curling around corners. Dust floated in the beams of the standing lamp, glowing like old ghosts. Every sound, from the refrigerator's hum to the ticking of the wall clock, grew louder in the vacuum of solitude. I thought about calling someone, Jake maybe, just to ask how the day went, just to hear a voice I recognized. But I knew what would follow. An awkward pause, the sound of distraction on the other end, the polite excuses. It would have felt like placing my dignity on a shelf and asking someone to knock it off, so I didn't. Instead, I picked up the remote and turned the volume down until the television moved without sound. I preferred the image without its voice. It reminded me of watching the factory floor from the overhead platform, movement without noise, action without meaning. I reached for the old envelope she had once left on my desk. Her handwriting was fading, the ink going pale at the edges. I didn't read it. I just held it, pressed it between my palms like it was something warm and alive. The presence of something gone is often stronger than its presence ever was. Outside, the street lamps flickered on. One by one, the yellow domes blinked into life, illuminating a street that had long since ceased to feel like mine. I counted them like old friends arriving late to a party no one remembered to attend. Even the air smelled different now, less of earth and asphalt, more of metal and ozone, like change waiting outside the door. I wandered through the rooms one last time before bed, touched the mantel, adjusted a crooked picture frame, stared a moment too long at the empty hallway, wondering if footsteps might ever echo there again. In the bedroom, the sheets were cold. I didn't turn on the heater. Cold felt honest. It matched the stillness in my bones. I lay down with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling, tracing the faint patterns left by the plaster, shapes only visible in moonlight. Sleep did not come quickly, but I didn't fight it. I just let the night settle over me like a thick blanket, not to comfort, but to cover. My thoughts drifted, not into dreams but into calculations. I thought about acreage, lease contracts, the next steps in escrow, the surveyor's report. Then I remembered Jake's face that morning when the letter came, and the moment he realized he didn't understand what he thought he owned. A small smile touched my lips, not cruel, just final. Some victories are not celebrated with trumpets. Some battles are won in silence, when no one's watching, and no one claps. Just an old man in his bed, beneath the weight of memory and dust, letting the night have him. And knowing, deep down, that peace doesn't always arrive with company. Sometimes it arrives exactly like this, alone, quiet, absolute. Monday morning arrived with the same gray light it always had. I didn't rush to get dressed. The ritual of early mornings had been so deeply etched into my muscles for decades that even in retirement, my body woke with the same sense of structure, even if the world outside no longer required it. I brewed coffee slowly, watching the thin line of steam rise like a thread connecting me to some lingering purpose. It was quiet in the house, the kind of quiet that doesn't beg to be broken. I didn't turn on the news. I didn't read the paper. I only listened to the slow drip of the percolator and the clock ticking steadily from across the kitchen. Then I looked at the calendar on the fridge. Rent due. Not for me, but for him. It wasn't about revenge. That was never the intention. But I had spent a lifetime studying numbers, trends, risks, and leverage. I had built the company from the ground up, not just with machines and manpower, but with a deep understanding of what balance truly meant. Not just financial, but moral, personal, generational. Jake never understood that part. He understood ambition. He understood power. But he never grasped the humility that tethered it. Somewhere along the way, he learned how to push forward, but not how to stand still. He thought everything I handed him came with a string of obligation. In truth, I had only hoped to give him foundation. Instead, he'd assumed ownership without weight, possession without roots. So, when I sold the land and left him the building, I wasn't trying to sabotage him. I was trying to teach him something I had learned in the hardest way possible. Nothing in life is free, not even legacy. I arrived at the office just after 8. The parking lot was half full, and the staff, most of them, still greeted me out of habit. Some gave hesitant nods, unsure whether I was visiting or interfering. A few smiled the same way they had for years, as if nothing had changed. Maybe it hadn't, not in the ways that mattered. I walked past the reception and through the main hallway, hearing the clatter of work resuming for the week. The smell of oil and metal still hung in the air. It grounded me, brought me back to the years I had walked these same halls with grease on my palms and fire in my lungs. But I wasn't here for nostalgia. I reached the front office where Jake now sat. The door was closed. That told me more than anything else. I didn't knock. Instead, I went down to accounting, the same department where I'd written my first invoice, mailed my first check, handled my first payroll when we only had 3 employees and a single overhead light that buzzed when it got too hot. I knew the new head of finance, a young woman named Helena, who was sharp, steady, and as meticulous with details as I'd been. She greeted me with a nervous energy, unsure how to navigate my presence. I handed her the lease agreement. She looked at me, surprised. I asked only one thing, that it be processed today. I didn't ask for confirmation. I didn't need it. She was thorough. I trusted her to do her part. Then I left. Not through the front, but the side entrance by the old vending machines, the one the workers used when they needed air or just a break from the fluorescent lighting. I paused there for a moment, remembering all the small conversations I'd overheard, the casual complaints, the whispered celebrations, the quiet confessions over stale coffee and too sweet soda. That's where a company really lives, in the in-between. I drove back home with the radio off, letting the road stretch before me like a page I didn't need to read anymore. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even satisfied. I felt balanced. Jake would open that invoice sometime before lunch. He would read the number. It wasn't unreasonable. It was a fair rate, based on square footage, location, current market value. Nothing punitive, nothing excessive, just business. The same kind of business he had always claimed to understand. Only now, he would face it without illusion. He would have to meet payroll and maintenance and overhead, while also writing a check, to me. And perhaps, just perhaps, in the quiet that follows that realization, he would start to ask the questions he never asked before. Not about money, about meaning, about weight, about what it takes not to just inherit something, but to carry it. I knew he wouldn't call. Not right away. Maybe not for a long time. Maybe never. Pride has a way of locking mouths that should open. I had been guilty of that myself, but he would think, that I was sure of, and in thinking, he would learn, and in learning, he might one day understand that the ground beneath a man's feet is never truly given. It is earned, brick by brick, handshake by handshake, signature by signature. Even when it's passed down, it demands payment, not always in dollars, often in choices. That evening, I sat in the backyard under the fading sun. The breeze was soft. The trees rustled without urgency. I watched a squirrel race along the fence line, tail flicking, unstoppable. I sipped water from a glass and let the weight of the day settle in my bones. Balance had been restored, not through fury, not through confrontation, but through structure, through math, through stillness. Through a quiet lesson he hadn't expected, but would remember. The morning sunlight filtered through the kitchen blinds in quiet slats, striping the wooden floor like faded lines in an old ledger. I stood at the counter, stirring my coffee without urgency, letting the spoon clink softly against the ceramic. The silence in the house wasn't cold. It was intact, preserved like a well-kept tool. No one called. No one knocked. No one needed me for anything. And that, in its own way, felt both sharp and clean. I had grown used to the stillness. It had taken time to understand that silence wasn't always absence. Sometimes it was a full statement in itself. Sometimes it was what you chose not to say that defined the boundary between wisdom and noise. I no longer rushed to fill every gap with opinion, advice, or remembrance. Let the world spin on its own inertia. I had said enough in my life. Now, I listened. Outside, the wind moved slowly through the oaks. Their leaves had started to turn. patches of yellow creeping into the green. The season didn't ask for permission. It just arrived. Like everything else, inevitable. I sat at the small table by the window, placed the coffee on a cork coaster, and looked out at the backyard. The grass had grown a bit too tall along the edges. I'd trim it later. Or maybe not. No one would comment on it. No one would step onto it. It was mine again. Not shared, not borrowed, not defended. Just mine. The mail came around 10. I heard the soft thunk of the flap and waited until the engine of the mail truck had rolled out of earshot before I opened the door. A small bundle sat in the metal box, mostly bills, a catalog or two, and one envelope that bore no return address, just my name in familiar handwriting that I hadn't seen in years, not since my brother passed. I set it aside. There were no expectations left to burden the day. Instead, I went to the garage and pulled out a small crate I hadn't touched in a long time. Inside, tools I'd kept not out of use, but out of memory. Items that had served me faithfully for decades, through winters and layoffs and late-night repairs no one else wanted to make. I cleaned the rust from a pair of pliers, replaced the dull blade in a utility knife, and set aside a few things for donation. "Work with your hands," my father used to say, "and you'll know who you are. The machines don't lie. The materials don't pretend. They don't flatter or betray. They just reflect your effort." I remembered that as I polished the head of a hammer that had cracked more than its share of frozen bolts. Its weight felt right in my hand, like an old truth that had never stopped being true. It had no voice, no argument, just presence. When I returned to the house, I passed the envelope again. It was still there, still untouched, still holding whatever it held. I left it be. Not every question needed an answer. Not every letter needed to be read. By afternoon, the sun had shifted across the backyard, painting longer shadows. I made a sandwich, plain and quiet. Bread, cheese, tomato. I ate it in silence, chewing slowly, watching the squirrels test their luck on the fence line. They moved with purpose, unaware of human politics or inheritance or betrayal. I envied their clarity. Later, I walked through the hallway and paused by the closet where the old work coats still hung. I hadn't worn one in months, but they held the shape of who I had been, a man of numbers and oil, a man of balance and grit. They didn't judge my decisions. They didn't care about the new generation's rise or fall. They simply waited, folded in cloth and years. I stepped out to the porch after sundown. The street was quiet. No children played. No dogs barked. Just the hum of a distant AC unit and the occasional gust of warm wind brushing the porch railing. I sat there until the sky turned a deep velvet blue. At some point, the lights turned on in Jake's house across town. I didn't need to be there to know that. I didn't need confirmation of struggle or clarity or realization. Life had its way of teaching, and people learned not when they were told, but when they were ready to understand. I no longer repeated myself. What needed to be known had been said already. In actions, not in words. In the way a door closed, in the way a check was signed, in the way a lease arrived by mail without a note. I had spoken, and my language was structure. The quiet held me like a blanket that no longer needed tucking. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt aligned, as if the world, for all its misfires and miscommunications, had finally remembered which direction true north lay. And I, for once, didn't need to steer it. No speeches, no confrontations, no dramatic ends. Only the slow settling of dust after the last nail had been hammered. Only the creak of the chair as I shifted my weight slightly, aware that the day had done its part. And that I had done mine. That morning, I woke before the sun, not because of age or habit, but because something in my chest had clicked into place overnight. It wasn't anticipation. It wasn't dread. It was the simple readiness of a man who had walked long enough to know the road wouldn't stretch much further. I sat on the edge of my bed, ran my hand over my knees, and felt the soft ache behind them, like a clock gently ticking. Time was still here, but not in a rush. The house held its breath, as if it too understood what the day would bring. Down in the basement, the air was cooler, still tinged with sawdust, metal, and the quiet ghosts of motion. I flicked on the light and walked past the long wall of drawers and tools. Each item had its place, just as it had for decades. Wrenches, calipers, broken bolts kept for no logical reason other than memory. The old bench greeted me like an old friend, its surface scratched and burnished by time. On it sat the small wooden box I had prepared the day before. Nothing ornate, nothing that would call attention. Just 6 compartments, lined with felt, each one labeled in my handwriting. I had used my last bottle of ink for that. Black, steady, clean. One slot held a folded deed, another a set of bank documents. Then came the set of workshop keys, a note scribbled in block letters, a sealed envelope, and lastly, a single screw. Stainless steel, heavy for its size. A type used only in industrial-grade machines that hadn't been manufactured in 30 years. It wasn't valuable, but it was the last one I had kept from the original press I ran when I started out at 25. The screw didn't symbolize anything to anyone else, but I remembered the day I picked it up off the floor after it popped loose during a midwinter shift. I remembered the clatter it made. I remembered the sting in my hands from the cold and the weight of responsibility on my shoulders, back when I had more ambition than sense. I tucked the box into an old messenger bag, one with scuffed corners and faded seams, and zipped it closed. By the time I walked to the garage, the sun had cracked the edge of the sky. I opened the door, stepped outside, and felt the chill of a new season crawling across the concrete. The silence of the neighborhood didn't feel hollow. It felt earned. I drove across town without music. The city had changed since I first came here. The storefronts had shifted. The streets had grown wider. But the bones were the same. I stopped at every light, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. There was no one rushing me now. No deadline. No boss. Not even a family member with an agenda. When I reached the building, I parked along the side where deliveries used to come in. The old signage had been replaced with a modern logo, sharp and soulless. I sat in the truck for a moment, staring at the facade, before I stepped out and walked toward the rear entrance. The security guard didn't recognize me. I didn't expect him to. I signed in with a visitor's badge, skipped the elevator, and took the stairs. My knees complained, but I welcomed the feeling. Every step reminded me that this place had once been mine, not in name, not in deed, but in sweat. On the 3rd floor, I knocked on the door I knew too well. It had a new plate now, a new name etched in polished brass. But I didn't linger. I walked past it and entered the old boardroom instead. It was empty, just how I wanted it. I placed the box on the long table, dead center, and sat down in the chair at the end, the same chair where I once sat during the meeting that changed everything. The same spot where I'd watched my ideas passed over, where younger voices with louder mouths carved up the future with charts and buzzwords. I sat in that chair, not to reclaim anything, but to feel the weight of having let go. The room was still. The city buzzed beyond the windows. Somewhere down the hall, printers hummed, shoes tapped linoleum, and a microwave door slammed. The world carried on. But inside that room, time folded quietly over itself. I stood up after an hour, placed the chair back under the table, and walked out without a sound. I didn't leave a note. I didn't alert anyone. The box was self-explanatory to anyone who had the patience to read, to ask, to piece it together. The final screw was in its place. That evening, I returned home and poured myself a glass of water. No toast, no celebration, no backward glance. Later, as the sky darkened and the cicadas took over the silence, I walked to the shed behind the house. I opened the door and stepped inside. The smell welcomed me. Metal, cedar, oil. I flipped the switch. The light buzzed overhead. Tools still lined the walls, dust gathering in the corners, untouched since the last project. But I wasn't there to fix anything. I walked to the far wall, where an old photo hung above the workbench. It showed me in overalls, a grease-streaked face, younger hands holding the very screw that now rested in that box downtown. I studied my expression. The photo was blurry, off-center, but the eyes, they knew what they were doing. They had seen the cost. They had chosen the road anyway. I stood there until my knees asked me to sit. So I did. And in that chair, in the soft glow of the yellow bulb, I didn't feel regret. I didn't feel triumph. I felt alignment. Like every tool, every bolt, every lesson had found its drawer again. And the noise, the years, the shifting loyalties, they all felt very far away. One man, one place, one chapter closed without ceremony, and not a single word wasted.